Hello, book lovers, and welcome to Authors Love Bookstores on a Mighty Blaze. I'm your host, Joe Moldover, author of the novel Every Moment After, and I am so happy to be back here with you today for our 83rd episode. Every week, my partner, Kimberly Hensel-Lawrence, and I travel across the US, Canada, and the United Kingdom, visiting independent bookstores and the authors who love them. And this afternoon, we are delighted to be in Bellows Falls, Vermont, visiting Village Square Booksellers. We are joined by neurologist and novelist Melodie Winawer. Melodie is the author of The Scribe of Siena, which has been translated into German, Czech, Polish, and Norwegian to critical acclaim. She is also the author of the new book Anticipation. Melodie is a physician scientist and associate professor of neurology at Columbia University. She's published over 50 articles and contributed to several anthologies. And she is coming to us from Ludlow, Vermont. Melodie, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It came up from 2 degrees, so we're feeling quite warm now.
So it's balmy. It's balmy in Vermont. And on the other side of your screen, we are joined by Pat Fowler from Village Square Booksellers in Bellows Falls, Vermont. Pat, thank you for being here as well.
Thank you. Yes, we it's been 2 degrees here too, so it's nice to be a little bit warmer. I don't think anybody went outside yesterday. It was a good day to stay in.
It's a good day to stay in with a book. It's always a good day to read a book. And we are here today, the three of us, because Melodie, you selected Village Square Books as your beloved local indie. And I wonder if you would tell us a little bit about why and what it is that makes this bookstore special.
So this bookstore is has a very special place in my heart because we relocated as a family to Vermont in October of 2020. And this bookstore was, in a way, the welcoming committee. For me, it was one of the first places we visited. I had just finished my novel, my second novel, as we moved here, and I was very excited about the opportunity to share it. And I walked into, this is the first bookstore I walked into when we moved here. Bellows Falls is about half an hour from our town, which also has a bookstore that was very welcoming. But this was sort of a special experience. And I walked in and immediately everyone welcomed me and they said, Pat's going to email you. So much is going to happen. We're so excited to meet you. And really the experience of this Vermont bookstore was so epitomized my experience of Vermont, which later rolled out. And so it was so unlike my experience of New York, where I had moved from, where nobody knows who you are, nobody cares. I mean, I'm from New York, so I have a fondness for it, obviously. But just the extraordinary kind of community of readers and of bookstores and writers and the excitement about welcoming people and, and sharing books was really palpable. And so over the next few months to over a year that we've been here, every time I take the train from Bellows Falls to go back to New York, I stop at the bookstore because I like to be early and not miss the train. And so I usually stop off and buy a book for my mother, for example, which I did last time, or for somebody. Another really remarkable thing that always seems to happen when I'm there is that I find a book that's incredibly special for one reason or another. And recently when I was there, I found face out in the poetry section 2 books featured by my 11th grade English teacher, Harry Bald, who is actually still a friend, the person who really brought me into the writing world multiple times. And in fact, the second time, because he helped me find an editor for my first novel. So it's sort of a recurring theme of welcome and discovery. And it's really exciting to be able to be with Pat today.
It's wonderful. Thank you. And by the way, I love this. I've read in your other interviews you've done about your 11th grade English teacher. And it's such a wonderful story, and just sort of a shout out. I mean, I loved my 11th grade English teacher, and just sort of a shout out for high school English teachers there. This is somebody who encouraged you to write. I think you've said elsewhere, encourage you to write as easily as you talk, or something like that.
Just write with the ease with which you speak. And I feel like that has been my mantra, kind of like just put it down, just say it onto the page. And when I've helped my kids, one of whom is really a writer, very much a writer, at now age 14, and we're thinking about collaborating. I say just say what's in your head
Yeah.
Let there be no barrier between you and the page, and she does that. It's wonderful to watch.
Well, and Harry then went above and beyond because he circled back and got you like an agent and a publisher. So like,
yeah,
I
he
mean,
my query letter actually, but don't tell anybody.
Okay, I mean, I'm going to contact my old English teacher and ask him where he was when I was looking for an agent. So that's great. I love that story. Pat, when Melodie says, I think really captures a lot of what people love so much about independent bookstores. The way that they're such an important part of a community, the way that they're places that we come back to again and again, and find new books, encounter books that we've loved in the past. I wonder if you'd say a little bit about your experience of being a bookseller and the community there in Bellows Falls, Vermont.
Well, we moved to Bellows Falls by accident. We were on our Dutch barge living in France when we had been on our sailboat, and we were away for 7 years, and we were looking for a place to settle down. And we were thinking of Vermont or New Hampshire, and this couple parked next to us they were chartering, and they were from Alstead, New Hampshire, and they arranged for us to stay in Walpole, New Hampshire. And someone in Walpole said, "Have you looked in Bellows Falls? There's some houses there and you might like it." And so we went across the bridge and we found this old four-square, with a wraparound porch, and we were just all excited. It was the first house that we saw in Bellows Falls, and we ended up buying it. And then a year later, I started getting involved in the community right away. I ran a music series, and there were all sorts of arts things going on. And then the person that owned the bookstore kept asking me to buy the bookstore because I'd had a bookstore in California when I was a kid. And I said, no, I'm retired. I don't want to do this. I've just been sailing for 7 years. And she said, "But the arts thing, it's going to stop if you're not here." So anyways, we ended up buying the bookstore, and then we moved it next door to a much larger space 2 years later. So I think the important thing about especially Vermont bookstores is that they're very involved in their local community. All of us are on various committees. I'm on the Friends of the Library Board. I've been a library trustee. I'm a justice of the peace. I am involved in the Saxons for the 4th of July, in the Downtown Association. I've been involved in the chamber. So there's lots of things that we end up doing. And so the bookstore becomes a focal point. If somebody wants information, they're going to come to the bookstore. So I guess we're a bunch of gossips.
I have to say, the two of you probably have the most interesting origin stories of any pair of, author and bookseller we've spoken with. So, I mean, very few booksellers open up by saying, "Well, I've been sailing for 7 years and I was on a barge in France." And then that's just not usually how people get into it. So that's wonderful.
And that was 20 some odd years ago. So, I'm glad I did it then, considering what's going on now. It's wonderful that I retired back in 92.
Pat, the audience question. People are excited that you're a justice of the peace. They want to know if you've ever married anyone in the bookstore.
Oh, several times. My cat disappeared. She got excited, but Bella has been the witness to several weddings over the years. The town clerk's office is right across the street, and many times the town clerk calls me and I perform a wedding right there on the spot. Or certain customers have wanted to have a wedding and they have family that come and everything. So.
Oh my God, that's so
a
great.
dream wedding in a bookstore, at least for nerds like me. So.
Well, I did a wedding for the owner of the Chinese restaurant here, and I decided to do it in the cooking section.
Oh, that's so good. Oh my gosh, what section do you go to if you're a wedding? That's brilliant. I think maybe my wife and I need to renew our vows at our local independent bookstore. I think that sounds incredibly perfect. All right. Well, people got their answer about that, and it was as satisfying as they wanted it to be. Melodie, I want to come back to you. I want to talk a little bit about writing before we talk about book selling. And you, I think, probably make everybody feel like an underachiever. I assume you live on like a 35-hour day schedule. And we were we were chatting beforehand. I mean, you and I are novelists with kind of similar day jobs. You're a neurologist, I'm a neuropsychologist, so we sort of hang out at some of the same parties. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about that for us, about that experience of sort of being a scientist and a clinician who also has this hat where you make up extremely creative and inventive and sort of uncategorizable types of stories. So, what's it like?
Yeah, so you're right that I mean, people ask me sometimes, how do you do everything? And I don't think of myself as an overachiever. I think of myself as just kind of a constantly moving person. So it's just energy really that fuels it, energy and love for what I do. And that keeps me going because I don't want to drop anything. Periodically, someone in my family says, Melody, you really need to drop something. And I can't think of what that would be. So I just keep doing all of it. Sometimes I'll add things and then everybody just throws up their hands. But so the experience of being a doctor and the experience of being a scientist both intersect in really interesting ways with fiction. They both interfere. They definitely interfere with each other, mostly because there's only actually not 35 hours in the day. And so I'm frustrated. But there are a lot of ways in which there's a synergy, which is really inspiring for me. One of them is, for the way that my science particularly intersects with historical fiction, which I guess if you had to categorize my books is what they would be called, although they're a little bit on the edge of magic. So maybe a little magical realism thrown in. So my scientific process often starts with a question, and it's a question I can't answer usually, and I'm puzzling about it. And then I read a little bit and I may not find an answer. And then I ask experts, which I have accessible to me, fortunately, because of my work environment. And if they don't know, and I don't find an answer in writing, I realize at that moment that I have found, or especially if there's controversy about the question, that it's not just that I don't know something, it's that maybe there isn't much known. And then I get very excited because that's an opportunity to sort of jump into the void. And that's my next project. Something that is not well understood, something that needs more, something that would really change the world if we understood it better, even in a small way. And that process of sort of finding a question and figuring out how to answer it is very similar to what has led me to each of my novels. A mystery that's unsolved, a question or a time or a place in which there's a gap that I can fill with. In the case of science, I write a grant, I write a paper, I do experiments, and I try to fill that with data. And if it isn't explicitly true, as far as I know, then I would lose my job. But in fiction, the delight is that I get to jump into the missing pieces between the facts and make stuff up. And that making stuff up to me is the ultimate antidote actually to the extremely data-driven life that I live on the other side of my head. Which I enjoy, but this sort of liberty of jumping into the void of fiction and filling in the gaps through imagination is really fun. Really fun. Strangely enough, sometimes that jumping into the void lands on reality. So I've had that happen a couple of times in this book, Anticipation, which is the book that just came out, which thank you, Pat, for featuring it front table. It's really exciting to see yourself next to big writers, which I did last time I was there. Always fun to drop in. So in this book, I imagined that a disease, which is very important in this book, a genetic disease, which becomes sort of a curse over generations. And I'm a neurogeneticist in my research, so that was sort of a natural path for me to take. I imagined that disease was very common in this area of Greece that the book's about, the southern Peloponnesos. So I was recently talking to Michael Darras, the physician to whom I dedicated this book, and he read it, and he, of course, loves it, and is very excited that it was dedicated to him. And now everybody thinks he's a Byzantine expert. He's a neurologist I work with, who's also from Greece. And he said, there are actually a large collection of families with this disease in that region of the world. I said, are you kidding? I made that up. But it turns out it was true. So sometimes this weird thing where I'll invent something like in The Scribe of Siena, which was my first novel, I invented a ledger that was an account book of the early Medici. And after the book was published, my spouse was traveling, went to an archive at Harvard and found a Medici ledger that looked like what I had described.
Oh my gosh.
So this is like the stuff you can't make up. You made it up, but it's real. So sometimes I think if you sort of inform yourself enough, and I do this both in my science and my fiction. The way I like to start a project is I just read, and I just read everything, and I don't choose what I read. And one thing will lead me to another, and then I'll read the reference in another book, or sometimes I'll just read a book, or I'll read an article, and then that makes me think of something else. And then there's one sentence, and then I just keep populating my head with information until I feel like I have a substantial amount of understanding, so I can sort of walk through the world of it.
Yeah.
And then once I'm there, then I can either say, okay, here's the missing pieces. This is the thread I need to follow in science, or these are the gaps where I can just throw stuff in. Here are the facts I want to hang my story on. Here's what's missing. And so that process is really quite parallel, actually, and they do inform one another.
Yeah. I love the way you describe that. I mean, I think you describe it so well, and I love the way you talk about it being a delight to be able to kind of liberate yourself from the scientific process and just make stuff up. I mean, I sort of have a similar experience. I mean, I feel like when you're doing clinical or scientific work, you have to be so kind of careful and meticulous, and you're so hemmed in by method and by facts, and it's just kind of such a release to kind of say, well, the only criteria I have to go by is what makes me happy. Is what I think is funny or interesting or whatever. So it's a great feeling. Pat, I want to come back to you. And part of what Melodie and I, excuse me, are talking about or touching on a little bit is this issue of genre. Melodie sort of touched on it a couple of times in terms of the work, in terms of her books. And I'm always interested in asking booksellers to talk a little bit about genre and their thoughts about genre. I think that writers oftentimes have a love-hate relationship with it. I think that it can feel sort of, it can feel constraining. It can feel like it's sort of like a pipe that's taking your work to a particular place that may not be exactly where you want it to go. And yet, when I walk into a bookstore as a reader, I just go straight to the shelves that I want to go to. So, I mean, I wonder what you think about it as a bookseller. Is it a useful concept? Is it limiting? How do you think about it?
Well, we've had different experiences at twice in the 20 years we've had the bookstore. We've kind of destroyed the romance section because nobody was there. And I think it's a question of which types of romances you're carrying. The Regencies aren't popular and certain other ones are. But I think the genre issue is really important in the YA teen section, because that's a real crossover area, because you have people that grew up reading the teen novels, and the teen books, they have a great plot. They're fast paced. They have good character development, but they're teen books. So a few years ago, about 3 years ago, we moved the teen section from over near the children's area over near the mystery and fiction and sci-fi area into its own little genre, because it's more of a crossover, and it takes up 4 or 5 bookshelves. And we have the more adult graphic novels there too. And I think that makes a big difference in how people feel. They don't feel like, oh, I'm still a child. I'm a teenager, but they still view me as a kid. And
I think a lot of adults read YA. So
that's why it's a crossover area. And the other thing is that we used to separate thriller from the regular mysteries, and now we have it all integrated together. So that takes up 5 bookcases. So as you can tell, we have a lot of people that read in those areas. And I think genre is good to get an idea of, when someone comes in the store and they're new, to kind of get an idea of what they're looking for, whatever they read in the past. And that's where the hand selling comes in, and the discussion with the bookseller. So that happens in all indie booksellers, is that, well, in our case, we greet everyone that comes in the door. Everyone gets a hello. So, it's not like you're going to walk in and you're a stranger. You're already a friend. And then, in a lot of times, they're repeat customers who are looking for the cat. We have to locate the cat for them so they can give her a hug. But the genre definitely. Sci-fi, some of those people never come out of genre, but then some people you can get to move over a little bit.
That's great. That's wonderful. Yeah, as somebody whose work is marketed as YA, I really appreciate your take on it, on the crossover potential. We were speaking last week to Left Bank Books in Belfast, Maine, and they had sort of play with genre. They had color coded their books to kind of blow up the genre system, which I kind of loved and kind of felt kind of transgressive. So I thought that was kind of cool. Erica Forensic is in the comments saying how much he loves Melodie's books. I think you guys, I believe you may have the same publisher, and
editor, and we actually have an event together in April, which we're really excited about. So
yeah, and of course, Girl in Ice from Erica is coming out very soon, so everybody needs to check that out. Melodie, let me come back to you on this genre issue. Do you find it constraining? I mean, do you find that there are certain sort of beats that you need to hit, given the type of book that you write? Do you feel like there are certain things that you're denied, that you're not allowed to do because of the lane that you're in? Or do you just write whatever the heck you want and sort of figure that the publisher will figure out what shelf to put it on?
So yes and yes, I guess. So when I wrote my first novel, Scribe of Siena, I really wrote the story that was in my head. A lot of people said this before I was writing. I didn't tell anyone I was even writing, but my mother-in-law is a poet, and she said, and I had really just started, you can't write it. It can't be longer than 400 pages because you can't have a first novel be longer than 400 pages. And I ignored that because I knew that it was going to be longer than 400 pages. It was 464 in its final iteration, but the first draft was 780. So I just knew that was going to happen. I said, this is going to be long. I'll fix it later. But all sorts of comments like that about this has to be this. Someone said, can you put more romance in it? Can you take out the time travel? I said, I really, if you don't like that aspect of the story, whatever it is, I can't help you with that because this is the story. There are a lot of great editing comments that I can take, and I was edited intensely by fabulous editors, but certain things, I couldn't really bend the story to fit a mold. And I think that, I'm a little peculiar. I think we're all a little peculiar, so I'm not unusually peculiar, but my peculiarities are that, I'm a scientist and a doctor, and I essentially like writing historical fiction, but I personally feel stuck if I'm only in one time. So I like multiple timelines. I like the porousness between past and present to be evident. So I think if there's any common theme between what I like to write, it's things in which the past and the present can influence one another. And we see the relationship between the past and the present. And I don't know that that's really a genre. I think that's more of a philosophy.
Mm, yeah.
And that's what holds my work together. I do understand this feeling of constraint though. And I really celebrate authors who manage to break out of that constraint. I wrote a novel, which I've never shown anyone, almost finished, which is very, very different. And I decided to hold off on it for various reasons. Maybe some of them are that I wanted to kind of continue on the theme that I was on and work on it for a while and have that be part of my relationship to my readership. But I don't think so much like I'm going to write this so that someone will buy it or so that my publisher will publish it or so that a reader, etc. For example, though, sometimes people are a little surprised because anticipation has battles in it. So Scribe of Siena does not have battles in it. So some people who read Scribe of Siena said, oh my God, the battles, and I said, well, battles are part of what is going on in this time period. This is not an overwhelmingly military book, Anticipation, but that's something that's happening. So as a result, I got into the head of a soldier, and I'm a Byzantine soldier, but I actually, at the time when we used to go to gyms, I was in a gym and I was working with a personal trainer who was an ex-army soldier, and she had been in hand-to-hand combat on the front lines. And I talked to her for hours because I wanted to understand what that experience was like, even though I was writing about, 13th century fighting. I think that the experience is sort of essential and carries you through. So, I think that I didn't want it to be the same. People say, is it a continuation? I didn't want to write a sequel. I missed the characters from my first book, but I really wanted to start over. I wanted to be in a different place. I wanted to have each book be a new experience. So I feel the restraint of genre. I also think it's valuable to some degree. It's helpful because historical fiction, for example, it does have a structural framework, which is useful.
Yeah.
So you have some facts. The facts kind of populate the world, and then within that world, you get to move around and do stuff. And so it's not entirely made up, as you say. It's sort of, a really good scaffolding of research. And then you learn what the rules are of the place. I mean, this is any world building is like this. And then you can kind of walk around with those rules in place and do what you want.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I'm going to be asking you in just a moment, the two of you, to talk a little bit about book selling and publishing. But before I do, I want to remind the audience, our current online audience, thank you for being here, and our audience in the future time, that we are here to support independent booksellers during a very difficult time. And this week, Village Square Booksellers, we are dropping links in the chat so that you can go to the online store and support Village Square. Pick up a copy of Anticipation, pick up a copy of The Scribe of Siena. If you like Melodie's work, check out Erica Forensic, River at Night, Into the Jungle, pre-order Girl in Ice. Look at me hand selling like this on the air.
Erica's going to be really glad she dropped in today.
I've spent a lot of time with booksellers, so if you like this author, try that author. I'm getting good at it. But the links are in the chat, and please do support the store. Pat, I want to come to you. So the mystery of success in publishing is probably not something that we're going to solve in the next 5 minutes. But as I said in the intro, Melodie's work has been widely praised and translated, which is wonderful. I feel like I sort of knew Melodie before I actually met Melodie, because there's sort of a Melodie buzz or a buzz around her work. And I just, one thing I want to ask you about that, Pat, is, is that something that you think you as a bookseller contribute to, or do you help to shape people's tastes? Do you prioritize books? Do you create buzz? Or do you just sort of have your finger to the wind like everybody else?
Well, a little bit of both, but we use an online ordering system called Edelweiss, and we put reviews on there, and those reviews for indie bookstores become part of the Indie Next system. Mm-hmm. So my employee Miles has gotten into this 2 or 3 times, and that kind of creates the taste, because a lot of times although we report to the New York Times bookseller bestsellers list, we mainly report to the indie bookseller list. And we have a table of indie booksellers for adults and for kids. And those books keep selling because they're on the front table. Some people only go in as far as the front door, and then they head for that table and the new release spinner, and that's as far as they go, especially now with COVID. They don't want to stay in some places. But we have staff picks on our shelves that Miles and I and a little bit my husband does, Alan. And the things behind us are advanced readers' copies, and the publishers send us those to look at. There's only 3 or 4 of us reading them, unfortunately. I wish we had more people helping us. But that's where the staff picks come in, and then we put reviews on Edelweiss, and that's how we create a buzz around a book.
Yeah, I always wondered where the Indie Next stuff came from. What about the people? Do you do a lot of hand selling in terms of what I just did on air, in terms of saying, you like Melodie Winawer, you've got to read Erica Forensic? I mean, do you sort of push authors based on your reader taste?
We have some favorite authors, and I always get disappointed when I find that one of my favorites got returned because that hasn't sold in a year. It means I haven't walked over to that shelf and pulled it and showed it to somebody. But yes, we do try to engage people. I mean, we don't hover over someone when they come in the bookstore. But if someone looks like they're lost or they're really searching around, we ask them if they need some help, and then we kind of guide them. And that's where you get into trying to find out what genre they like reading. Or let's say someone's looking for a gift, like an aunt is looking for a gift for a child, and what has the child read? Mm-hmm. And what are they? What level are they at? What age are they? Are they a good reader? Do they like graphic novels? Do they like fact or fiction? So you do kind of, that's where it comes into engaging people. When you go into a big box store, no one's talking to you. And even online, unless you put your fingers in there and start looking, it's all up to you in that case. It's not, you're not feeding off of someone else's brain trying to come up with ideas on some suggestions. And we also know what other people in the community are reading. So, if I've sold 25 copies of something, that's a pretty popular book.
Right.
So I know that, gee, I know this person, and gee, they kind of are friends with that person. So maybe they'll be interested in that book.
Yeah.
It's where you're nosy bookseller, where you know everybody in town.
Well, I mean,
recommendations I've got have been walking into indie bookstores like this one and saying, I really like this book. Can you help me find something kind of like that? I'm looking for something upbeat, but not superficial, not too grim. I really love this novel. What else do you recommend? Or something that isn't on the front table. Show me something mid-list that's only got its spine out that I wouldn't find otherwise. It's really fun to get that kind of hand-picked experience.
Absolutely. I mean, my local indie is Wellesley Books in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and I'm always telling them that I love the book that I got there, and I never would have picked it up if they hadn't, if they hadn't recommended it. So I just feel like I'm constantly finding new authors and new books. Melodie, I want to ask you about selling your own books. I feel like in the world of writers, there's sort of a range of attitudes from sort of one end of the spectrum, which is something along the lines of, it's my job to write the book and the publishers and the booksellers need to sell it, versus people at the other end who just sort of seem to live on social media, and I don't know when they're actually writing their books, because they're so busy sort of trying to sort of chase that elusive buzz and network and so forth. We've dropped your social media handles in the chat. I definitely encourage people in the audience to follow you because it is fun to hear what you have to say. But what for the writers and prospective writers in our audience, how do you live, and what do you kind of recommend in that regard?
So I think it's a balance. I knew I had tipped the balance too far when, often I do yoga every day, and I've done it for 21 years. Back basically at this point on my own, I used to teach it. And during yoga, often I would come up with new things to write. I mean, a lot of my books would sort of appear in my head, conversations or paragraphs while I was doing it. And I realized as I was having Twitter tweets appear in my head that I had gone too far and that it was diverting my creativity a little direction, right? So the problem is that I was thinking for a while, especially when I was first, coming into the world as a newly published debut author, social media filled my head. And although it was very useful and very exciting to engage with readers and other writers, and I think that's still the best thing about it, it can kind of tip the balance. But I think my approach has been, I'm a doctor and a scientist. I have 3 kids, and I would like to continue writing novels. So I don't feel like I can spend a huge amount of time on self-promotion. I'm very grateful that I have a publishing company to help me with that. On the other hand, what I think is really fun about social media at its best is that there's a fantastic writing community out there, and writers are by and large incredibly supportive of one another, and we're all sort of lonely in the same way. I mean, not that we're, isolated, horribly hermit people, but a lot of the experience of writing is solitary, and there's a lot of self-doubt, and you always think you're terrible. Not always. There are moments where you think you're absolutely great, and they last about 30 seconds, maybe if you're lucky, 30, and then you think it's terrible again. And so it's wonderful to see that sort of playful, supportive, and sometimes despairing, supportive, and sometimes exultant, supportive, community. I also love the experience of connecting with readers. And that is exhilarating, actually. I think a lot of readers think that writers don't want to be bothered. I'm not one of those writers. I really like to be bothered because I love the experience of having those words that sat in my head for years suddenly be out there and having people responding to them. I do online book clubs. I did actually, when it was Skype, and now Zoom book clubs, way before we were all forced to do them. All the time, which allowed me to connect with readers all over the country and even internationally. And I find that it is that moment, and the great bell hooks, who was Gloria Watkins, who actually I was lucky enough to have as my college English teacher.
Oh, wow.
who has recently passed. I had the opportunity to hear her speak at the Tucson Book Festival a few years ago when Scribe came out, and I spoke to her again in person, and I think she remembered me. She said she did. That probably wasn't true, but she said, the moment at which a book enters a reader's hand is when it takes flight and the arc of the story is completed each time in a new way. And it's really a privilege to be able to quote what she said to me, because it was just a one-on-one conversation. But I think that is so true and so beautiful and social media is a way to do that over and over again, with writers and with readers. And what I try to do on social media, because self-promotion feels really uncomfortable to me, is just see whether it took me a while to figure this out, whether I can be who I am. And let that be who I am on social media. I try to be who I am everywhere else. Just be a genuine person, be supportive of other people. If you have something to celebrate, share it. If you're struggling with something, ask people what they think. And so I try to use it as a platform for encouragement of others, people who are having trouble getting rejected. A lot of times I had 16 rejections before my first novel was bought by a Big Four publisher in a preempt. So that's kind of one of those stories where I say, if you give up, you won't succeed. If you don't give up, you might succeed.
Yeah. That's well said. That's well said. That's wonderful. And it's a beautiful sentiment about I won't try to requote it from memory, but about the arc of the book being complete. There's nothing more to say about that. Pat, I want to come back to you. I want to sell some books, and you're the pro. So I think we should talk to the audience a little bit about some of the recommendations we have. I have a couple of questions for you. The first is, and this is from an audience member. The first is your go-to book recommendation. I'm not going to tell you anything about who wants to read it, what kinds of things they like. I just wake you up out of a deep sleep and I say, what book should I read? What's the one book I should buy? Do you have a go-to?
Well, Louise Penny and Archer Mayer, the mystery series. Archer Mayer is our bread and butter author for this bookstore. He comes in every third Friday in October, and we have a full house and sell over 100 books every year, 125, 150 books every year. So we usually try to get people started on, especially if they're visiting. There's a book called Bellows Falls. It's not necessarily positive about Bellows Falls, because he writes about some of the bad things that happen in Brattleboro and Bellows Falls in Vermont. But we usually point people to that. And Louise Penny, because it's a very interesting, detective series, police series. But I like Kristen Hanna. I like a lot of our local authors. We have a lot of great Vermont authors. Vermont's an inexpensive place to live, so there's a lot of authors living here.
Yeah.
Sarah Stewart Taylor, Eileen Charbonneau, Bill Lockwood, some of our very local people, and we're always happy to promote our local authors.
Absolutely. I'm always, as I mentioned before, my work is sort of on the YA shelf, and I'm always interested in asking people about the books that kind of shaped them and their their reading tastes in their lives when they were younger, and I oftentimes find that there's sort of an author and a book that was just especially important. I mean, for me, it was Lloyd Alexander, the great, wonderful writer. And Pat, my impression, I think we've probably only scratched the surface here, but my impression is that you've lived an interesting life, given where we found you on a barge in France. And I wonder if we go back to your early reading career, if there's a book or books or an author that really influenced you.
Well, I hate to, obviously it's Agatha Christie. I never really read children's books. I went straight from picture books to reading adult books for some reason. And my mother and my brother were reading Agatha Christie and Dorothy Sayers and Marjorie Allingham and all of those other authors, those good old no sex and violence really, but good detective stories. And I started out reading Agatha Christie, and one of the interesting things was visiting authors' homes when we were living in England on our sailboat. We actually bought a car so that we could drive around, because a boat, you're on the edge.
Right.
So we bought a used car and drove around to see authors' houses. But yeah, I'm pretty firmly in the mystery and then historical fiction area.
Got it. Well, as a side note, I think you should give some very serious thought to writing a memoir. But
In my spare time.
I mean, I remember that when I was young, the first time I read, and then there were none. I think it sort of changed the wiring of my brain. Melody, what about you? I wonder if there's anything that comes to your mind. I was so happy to see you nod when I said Lord Alexander, because I'm always
I mean, I'm lucky. I have 3 kids who are teens, and to some degree I've been able to shape what they read occasionally. And Lloyd Alexander I gave to my son, who loved them all. But there were a few writers who really shaped my childhood. You would probably not be surprised to know that one of them was Mary Renault, who's really just a giant in historical fiction, mostly about ancient Greece and Macedonia. It was through Mary Renault that my first love, people say, who was your first celebrity crush? And it was definitely Alexander the Great, which I think, pins me as a true history nerd. Obsessed with him actually for years. And I recently started rereading her work, in part to just see how she does it. Now that I'm doing it, just creates immediately a totally believable world where the past is present and you don't feel this awkwardness that you're in it, and this is how it is. Also, though, I was really loved mysteries as a kid. I spent a lot of time curled up with them. Read all of Sherlock Holmes as a child, and I was obsessed with Dorothy Sayers. Actually, memorized much of Gaudy Night. I studied Latin. 5 years of Latin and ancient Greek. I was a totally classics head. And so there's actually the great love words, like the most dramatic romantic moment in Gaudy Night is in Latin. And I was just completely beside myself with excitement as a high schooler seeing that happen. And I got very into it. I also had the misfortune or fortune of falling in love with an author, almost all of whose books were out of print. Rumer Godden. An amazing novelist who wrote a lot of really powerful sort of dramatic novels. She grew up in turn of the century England, recently has died, and spent a lot of time in India. And her books are just the way that she writes, their style of writing and her stories, incredibly compelling. In This House of Breed, The Green Gage Summer, really just beautiful. And I had a book of her short stories when I was a kid that my mom gave it to me as a gift, and I was furious that she bought me it, and then became preoccupied with it and read it over and over again. It's so nice. And it was a book called Gone, which are stories about sort of lost childhood. Really, really compelling. And it was one of the first books I brought when we moved to Vermont, and we couldn't bring very much at once. Yeah. Sort of reconnecting with her books. And I used to get them when it was hard to find books that were out of print, not like now where you can find them anywhere. And I would go to individual used bookstores in the Upper West Side where I lived and ask them to do book searches. And then 6 months later, they would find one and say, your book is here. So it was this very long, drawn out process of collecting all her work, which I eventually did starting in high school. So those are some of the people who shaped my childhood reading.
Love it. And Kimberly is working furiously behind the scenes to drop links into the chat so that people can buy some of these books from Village Square Books online. So everybody should be clicking furiously away. Let's pivot to contemporary stuff. Pat, it's January 2022. What are people buying, and what are you putting on the front table these days? What are you recommending to people right now?
Well, they're still reading mysteries. It's really, really strong, and historical fiction. We've had a lot of people over the pandemic where they've gotten old mystery series, like the whole Ivanovich series or the whole Jacqueline Winspear or Louise Penny series. Mm-hmm. And it's been interesting to see that. I think we're due for another snowstorm, so it's quiet today. But I think tomorrow we're going to have a bunch of people coming in. We usually find that people come in the day before the big snowstorm, and then the day after all the snow is dug out, because they ran out of books and they didn't have a thing in the house. So it's going to be interesting to see what the blizzard that's coming will do for us.
Absolutely. Melody, what about you? I wonder if there are some books that you would like to talk about or recommend that you're feeling excited about these days.
Sure. I am currently reading two books because I have events coming up in conversation with two authors. And so I'm reading them simultaneously, which I don't like to do because the events are back to back. And I'm incredibly excited about both of them, and I'm trying to read them in the right order. The first is a book that's about to come out February, Gillian Cantor's Beautiful Little Fools. It's her 11th novel. Jillian and I are doing an event together next week with the Yankee Bookshop. I met her in Tucson. We had a wonderful dinner on the hills with margaritas for the first time I've ever had margaritas. I think I talked a little bit too much. It was really fun. And I was really inspired by her. Her work is amazing. This is a sort of a retelling of The Great Gatsby from the perspective of the women. Very engaging, incredibly interesting to have flipped that perspective, a very multiple point of view, something of a mystery, actually turns it into a mystery, totally gripping, recreates the time beautifully. I'm very worried about what's going to happen. And the character development is amazing. I'm totally absorbed and very much living in 1918. The other book that I'm reading right now, also because I'm collaborating with an author, is with Raina Dai-Randell, who writes Chinese historical fiction, an amazing book that just came out, The Last Rose of Shanghai, which is a portrayal of something I knew nothing about whatsoever. Also, first sentence, I was breathless and completely wrapped up. And the only reason I put it down is that my event with Jillian is first. So I'm really excited about Last Rose of Shanghai and Beautiful Little Fools. Both recommend very, very strongly, really powerful women's point of view too, with a very, very, very strong sense of place and time, which is wonderful.
Yeah,
Great recommendations.
That Shanghai book sounds interesting. I majored in Chinese history in graduate school.
It's really something I had no idea about, and it's fascinating, about Jewish immigration to Shanghai during the war. So
that's true. My professor was Jewish, and he had been in Shanghai.
It's very, very interesting.
Yeah.
So
it's totally fascinating, and the links are in the chat. So I want to remind everybody to pick up a copy of Village Square Books along with Anticipation. We're winding down on time, which is hard to believe. It's been a complete delight to talk to the two of you. Audience is doing one last call for a memoir from Pat, so we'll see. We'll see.
She kept me on the phone for an hour and a half. It was so fabulous. I was really only stopped because I had to have a meeting.
I do have lots of photo albums of the and before we moved here, we had a newspaper article about his voyage to Vermont.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, when we stop by the store, we'll be able to take a look. Pat, we usually, as I said, as the audience knows, come to you as the bookseller for our last question of the discussion, and it's a fill in the blanks. And here's how it goes. Being a successful independent bookseller is part luck, part hard work, and part what else?
Respect for your local community.
Oh, that's great. I love that. That's wonderful. That's a wonderful answer. It is our 83rd. It's a unique answer that we've not heard before. Thank you. I love that. It's been completely wonderful to talk to the two of you. Thank you both so much for coming on the show and for spending time with me and with the audience today, and with the audience who will watch this in the future. Melodie Winawer, author and neurologist. I want to remind the audience to follow Melodie on social media. The handles are in the chat. Pick up a copy of Anticipation. Pick up a copy of The Scribe of Siena. Do it through Village Square Books. Pat Fowler, Village Square Booksellers in Bellows Falls, Vermont. It's been wonderful spending time with you. And stay warm in the snowstorm. And best wishes to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for including us here. We're very happy to.
Really fun.
To the audience, thank you for joining. Thank you for joining us, and we will be back here next week, 4 p.m. Eastern Time. We're heading to City Books in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So we will see you there. Until then, stay well and keep reading.